Welcome back to Rod's Radios. This is the latest project. It's a Siemens model RG44, a mains valve radio from 1963. And it was bought recently at an auction in Germany for a very modest sum. And hopefully I'm going to try and restore it and bring it back to life. It looks a little bit shabby at the moment, as you can possibly see. The numbers on the buttons, for instance, are worn off, although they'll probably be able to be refurbished. Sadly, there is a crack in the glass at the front here, but I should be able to fix that. That's not too obtrusive. The cabinet is in pretty shabby condition. It's showing signs of wear and tear. Obviously, this radio has had a lot of use, so it'll be interesting to see how it comes back to life, if at all. Let's have a look round the back. Round the back it tells us that it's a Siemens Regal Super type RG44, and we have here the FM aerial. It's an internal aerial that gets plugged into the socket on the back, so we put that one out of the way. And we've sockets here for the FM aerial and also the AM aerial and earth, and then along the bottom a socket to, it says phono. This would be to attach a record deck to it. There's also a tape socket here and an extension loudspeaker socket. Up here it tells us that there's a 0.6 amp fuse in here, and I would imagine you can change the mains voltage for various different types. And it says it consumes 40 watts of electricity. So let's take the back off and have a look. Just before I do that, this is the mains lead that's on it, and this is the typical European 2-pin plug that would have been fitted on that in those days. So I take the back off. And inside we can see the various valves that make up this valve, or tube radio as it's sometimes called. And I can see it has, most of the valves are Siemens valves. The Siemens logo is on this one, this one, this one, although this one is a Telefunken valve. So the lineup is pretty usual for this type of radio from this era, although in 1963 this would be coming towards the end of valve radios, after which of course transistors took over. So the lineup here is the VHF or FM tuner with an ECC82 presumably. Then the mixer oscillator for the AM section, ECH81, an EF89 IF valve, EABC80 discriminator valve, and the amplifier valve, the EL84, and then a big beefy transformer here on the right hand side. So it's a bit dusty and dirty inside, so it's going to need some work in cleaning it up before we start working on it. Now sadly, I've just noticed that the ferrite rod aerial in here is actually broken. The rod itself is broken and it's hanging over on its side. So that's going to need a bit of work done on it. Other than that, there's the remnants of spiders and dust and dirt, which will need to be cleaned out. But let's see what happens to this. It looks like a promising radio. It has two very nice loudspeakers on it, a big beefy bass loudspeaker and a smaller treble loudspeaker. So the next thing is to get the chassis out, give it a clean up, inspect it and see what it holds in store for us. With the chassis out, we can get a better look at what's going on here. On the front of the receiver we have a volume control, tone control, above which is a magic eye for the tuning of the stations. And then across the front here we have the various piano key buttons. The first one is the on-off switch. Then we've got the wave bands, long wave, medium wave, short wave and FM. And then across the top there's a separate row of buttons with the first one being the gram button. If you wanted to, you could attach a phonograph or a record player onto this machine. And then there are three tone buttons labeled Hi-Fi, SP for speech, and bass for the bass tones. Now, unfortunately, all those buttons are stuck, so they're going to need a little bit of work. The dial glass itself, as I mentioned, is actually broken here, so I'm going to have to try and fix this so it's not too obtrusive. But the glass itself looks as though it has kind of a frosted front to it. I thought initially it was just grime and dirt, but I think it's slightly frosted glass, which is a little bit unusual. Then over on the right hand side we have the tuning buttons. The tuning button is adjustable via a clutch system, which is a neat piece of engineering, so that when you select the AM stations, it tunes this particular tuning capacitor up here, and when you switch over to FM, the clutch mechanism now attaches the tuning knob to this tuning capacitor over here. So rather nifty. Now this is the ferrite rod that I mentioned that's broken, so there are there's one wire here I can see that's actually off already, so I'm going to have to try and find out where that goes to. And other than that, the dial bulbs are particularly black, so I'm sure they're dud at this stage. And behind here you might be able to see the electrolytic capacitor, which looks as though it's crooked, but in fact that's the way it's made. The bracket on it is slightly tilted. And let's have a look around the top. Looking down at the top of the chassis, I can immediately see that there's a capacitor here that's going to have to be replaced. It looks pretty dry. It's sitting on top of the mains transformer, so that will be replaced. Other than that, there doesn't seem to have been much work done on this radio throughout its lifetime. So that in itself means that the possibility of getting it up and running again is pretty good. So time to start work. The chassis is out of the cabinet now, and it's fitted into my wooden frame here. And this allows me to move the radio around so I can either work on the bottom or work on the top without doing any damage to any of the fragile components. Now these buttons on the front, or these levers on the front, were stuck originally, and I've used some WD-40 and that's actually freed them up nicely, so they are working quite well. I've switched the radio on and it's working to some degree. The FM seems to be extremely good. However, the medium wave is not so good. And I think that has to do with the ferrite rod aerial, which was originally broken. Now I have glued it together, but I don't think that's a long-term solution. So in the meantime, I've dug out an old ferrite rod from another radio, which was scrapped at some stage. So I'm going to cut that down to size and replace that into the main radio. The other thing I've noticed was that the Magic Eye tuning valve was extremely weak. You can just about see the green bars running across, but typically what happens in a valve as it ages is that in this case the phosphors disappear and wear out. So I've ordered one of those, but it may be several weeks before it comes back in. So hopefully that will cure that problem. Also, around the back of the volume control, the volume and tone controls, which are a dual component, which you can maybe able to see down there, they were quite noisy. So again, some switch cleaner has sorted that problem out. Other than that, the bulbs on the dial drive have been replaced too. They were both faulty, so new ones are going to light up, hopefully, the front of the radio when it goes back into the cabinet. Looking underneath the chassis, normally the first thing you would do with radios of this vintage is to replace all the capacitors, because they tend to have disintegrated at this stage. However, in this case, the capacitors were in extremely good condition. They're very high quality ones. These are Philips, these brown beige capacitors, and they just don't change value. However, I was concerned about some of the components on the tone and sound output stage here, which I wasn't too sure about. So I removed this panel here and checked all the capacitors, and in actual fact, every one bar one was in absolutely perfect condition. The one capacitor I did decide to change, even though the value was correct. The equivalent series resistance was quite high on it, and that's the cathode bypass capacitor, the 50 microfarad capacitor in the sound output stage. So that was in fact the only component I had to replace down here. The rest seemed to be absolutely spot on, which is amazing on a radio of what, some 55 years old maybe. The ferrite rod aerial was taken out of the receiver, and here it is on the bench, and the long wave coil and the medium wave coil have now been fitted into a new length of ferrite rod, so hopefully that'll improve reception on the AM bands. It's now ready to be popped back into the receiver and soldered in. Here, the new ferrite rod is back in place, secured with cable ties, and the coils aligned for maximum sensitivity in the medium and long wave bands, finally sealing them in place with candle wax. Next, the speaker board was examined, and the cones of each unit were in great condition. The tweeter speaker is somewhat unusual, being made of plastic. However, when the filter capacitor shown here was checked, the normal value being 10 microfarad, it measured over 5 times this level, with, in addition to this, a higher than normal ESR, so this was swiftly replaced. One of the things I wanted to do with this radio before I fitted it back into the cabinet was to fit a Bluetooth module in order to use it along with an iPod, iPhone or iPad. And to facilitate this, I needed an arrangement whereby the power to the Bluetooth module only took place when the tape button or the phono button was selected. Otherwise, there was going to be interference between the Bluetooth module and any of the radio bands, particularly the medium, long and short. And the way I did this was, first of all, to fit a micro switch here at this point on the back of the chassis, and then, this may sound strange, but glued on a long matchstick onto the slider of the tape switch and a little bracket on the end here to make contact with the micro switch, so that now when you switch over between off and tape, you'll see that the rod goes in and out and actuates the switch. This switch has its contacts connected to the 6.3 volt, which feeds the Bluetooth module and makes it work. And in that way, the Bluetooth module will not interfere with the radio when it's on. This is the Bluetooth module prepared and ready to go back into the cabinet along with the chassis of the radio. And separate to that, you'll see up here, I brought wires up to the front here and connected up a blue LED, so that when the Bluetooth module is in operation, it should shine out through the front glass, indicating that Bluetooth mode has been selected. One of the faults that showed up on the radio when it started working again was that when you switch it off, there was a residual sound coming from the loudspeaker over a period of about a second and a half, as the output stage drained itself. And the reason for that was traced back, in fact, to the on-off switch here, as well as the switching the mains to the receiver on and off each time you select one of the wave bands, or not, as the case may be. There was a separate pole here that shorted out the loudspeaker when the switch was turned off. And when I measured the resistance across this switch when it was closed, there was still a residual resistance of about 1.5 ohms, which was enough to allow the speaker to continue to work even when the radio was switched off. And no matter how many times I cleaned the contacts on this switch, the fault continued. So the only way around it was as follows. And here you can see I've fitted a relay onto the backboard of the dial. It's a mains relay connected up to the mains, and the switch contacts go back to tandem with what was originally here. So in fact, this switch is now cutting out when the power is switched off, and in that way the fault has disappeared. Happy days. One of the modifications I do with these radios is to fit a new plug with a new mains lead. You can see the old one on the left here. It was a 2-pin German Schuko plug. The radio has now been fitted with a 3-pin plug and lead. That means that the chassis is now permanently earthed for safety. And the plug contains a separate fuse at 3 amps, again as a safety consideration. While waiting for parts to arrive, I turned my attention to the cabinet, which was looking the worse for wear. This involved stripping and sealing the woodwork, which is an interesting challenge. Many radios of this era, the 60s that is, adopted a more modern design than the larger, darker cabinets from the previous decade, and took their cue from Scandinavian decor of the period. Before stripping the cabinet, it was necessary to fill the gaps in the front grille with outsized matchsticks in order to protect the dust filter at the back, at the same time preventing anything clogging up these slots. After 2 sessions of coating and scraping off all the surfaces, the cabinet was sanded, cleaned with methylated spirits, and sprayed with 4 coats of matte silk varnish. Finally, the matchsticks were removed and a wax coating was applied to finish the job. The buttons and escutcheon on the front of the receiver were in a poor condition, in that the letters were well worn, so new labels were produced on a label maker, and here you can see the before and after results. They were then placed back into the chassis. In order to repair the broken dial glass, I decided to join the pieces by supporting them at the rear with box cutter blades. Here I've roughened the surface of the one on the right in order to glue it successfully to the glass. I then positioned 3 of these in the appropriate position across the break before fixing them with epoxy resin glue. Checking the result a few days later seems to have done the trick. 6 weeks later, the Magic Eye finally arrived from China. Here it is in all its glory, and as you can see it's illuminating quite nicely. And as I tune in and out, you'll see the green bars come across suitably. Now I did have to change one component because the characteristic of this valve is slightly different to the original. So by fitting a 3 meg resistor between the grid and earth, it operates nicely, whereas before the green segments were overlapping far too early. The other thing you can see here is the safety capacitor between mains and chassis, which I've fitted. These are actually 2 capacitors in series because I didn't have the right value, but they work quite nicely. In the meantime, I checked the alignment while I was waiting for this valve to come in. The alignment is absolutely perfect on this set, so it didn't need any adjustment whatsoever. And just to give you a flavour of what it sounds like at the moment, I'll turn up the volume. So as you can see, or hear at least, it's working really nicely. So the next thing is to take the chassis out of the frame that I was using to work on this, fit the dial glass across the front, bung it back into the cabinet, and hopefully it's still working. So let's do that. So here we are with the final result. Let's have a listen. First of all, on long wave, we only have one local channel here. It's our local station in Dublin.
So if you weren't ready for that, clear a bit of space in the kitchen or wherever you might be, because Mr. Motivator is in the house and he's going to give you another mini.
And medium wave. This time of day, there's not an awful lot to listen to. Some stations from the UK, but there's a lot of interference here in the garage where the radio is located. Shortwave can be good, depending on the time of day.
US, Israel, Europe, China, Russia. Nice girl, right?
Get in the book.
Tuning on shortwave is going to be very critical because it's spread over the whole band. And finally, FM, which is what we listen to mostly in this country.
No blast, no fry. Shake it all about. Now, what you do is pretend you're driving.
Gossip.
Sonic Winds, Finnegan's Wake.
98 FM.
Ireland's best-selling car brand in 2021.
Check that out online on Today of Experience. Is anything to go by.
And even part, as I mentioned, northeastern Brazil, although it is not exactly.
So the coverage is particularly good on the FM band, but then of course there's more, because as I mentioned earlier, I had fitted a module, a Bluetooth module in it, so that I can use my iPod or iPad or iPhone or whatever to play music remotely. And to do that, we select the tape button, because the module is plugged into the back of the tape socket. And you'll see what happens. Keep an eye on here, because this is where I fitted the little blue LED.
We will come out the other side of it as well.
You see the blue LED comes on, starts flashing.
Bluetooth mode.
And the announcement comes up to say that Bluetooth is on. So now I can play some, in this case, royalty-free music, just to give you an idea of what it sounds like. And of course I can control the volume and the tracks, etc. remotely on the iPod in this case. So that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have been, thanks for watching.